just going to sit idly by and say, "Oh, okay, fine. I'll want to become, the serf to someone who has all these superhuman capacities. Assume we're going to do something about it." But it is a valid concern. I think this person had a question first.
The one thing that you mentioned about the enhancement of the children, I agree with the enhancement in general, but enhancement that affect the germline of the human subjects that can be inherited through the several generations. What do you think? The enhancement of children is different from eugenesis, or what do you think if that enhancement or selective reduction actually decrease the capacity of diversity in the human being and actually reduce the amount of evolutionary capacity of the human being? Is that true or not?
Well, there are two types. There are somatic enhancements, which you can have even if it's for children. They're just affecting that in a child. So that's one issue. And you're talking about germline enhancements, which would be inherited. That does raise a whole host of separate issues, because obviously, among other things, we have to be very, very sure that that is something we want to do, given the consequences. Among other things, I would think before we introduce any germline enhancements, we want to make sure we had technology to reverse that if we had to. And I don't think that's impossible to think about that. In other words, if we put in something, for example, that most people would think would be probably beneficial, something that would increase our immunity to certain diseases, so that could be passed on to future generations. That seems like a pretty good idea, right? But maybe it'll have consequences later that we didn't predict. It could lead to problems. Well, so before we introduce a germline enhancement, we probably want to make sure we have the ability to reverse that if it turns out to be something bad. But I don't think, there is inherently something wrong with germline enhancements. Because they have different sets of consequences, it does mean we have to approach them differently from somatic enhancements. That is, enhancements.
But the methodology for understanding the germline enhancement is quite different from the somatic, because the effect that the intervention that you're doing today may have the effect 100 years after that, and it couldn't be. It could be irreversible. So scientifically, I don't think there is any methodology that can assess the germline enhancement effects on humans. At least for a short period of time. Not
right.
I mean, you can see the effect with like 100 years, but at that point it's irreversible.
I wouldn't necessarily be irreversible. It depends on what the technology is. Presumably we have the technology to introduce a germline enhancement, and we're nowhere near that. But if we have the technology to introduce that, presumably we should have the technology to reverse it. And if we don't, perhaps we should not have germline enhancements. But as I said, I don't see why you would say you'd have the technology to put in a germline enhancement, but it's impossible to have the technology to reverse it. Unless the enhancement leads to us losing so much cognitive capacity we can no longer use the technology. But
actually, we have the technology.
Let's move to another question, and we'll come back if there's time.
Yes.
What can be done to drive a deeper wedge between political arguments and considerations vis-a-vis or as in contrast to religious influences in setting public policy? We have these influences, and they're there. But if we were going to move toward a more secular application, or applying secular principles to the creation of public policy, what can we do to further eliminate the religious influence in setting this policy?
just every opportunity you have, you should say that religious dogma should have no influence on public policy. That, in fact, just because someone's a bishop, a minister, a rabbi, what have you, an imam, why does that give them any authority to speak to these issues? And in fact, if we're shaping our public policy based on their pronouncements, it's cutting other people off from participating in that discussion. Because you can't argue with someone who says, this is my dogma, that's why I'm going to do this. And it's the end of the discussion. So if we value democratic discourse, if we value the contributions of each citizen to discussion about policy, and I think we should, then allowing religious doctrines to shape our public policy is very detrimental to that. And unfortunately, we've kind of accepted it. And I think one reason we've accepted it is we think, well, let's face it, I mean, throughout, centuries, even today, people think, well, religion, that gives us our answers to moral questions. So if we think public policy, at least some public policies are based on moral principles, we have to turn to religion. And I think we have to break that connection. I think it is being broken increasingly in certainly some Western countries. But we have to keep plugging away at that and show that, in fact, not only do we not need religious principles for morality, but trying to base public policy on religious principles just won't work. And that's especially true. I mean, one good thing about, there are many good things, I think, about the increased religious diversity in, for example, the United States and other countries is that it's harder to say, okay, we're going to tie in, public policy and religious beliefs because what religion? It used to be the United States was overwhelmingly Protestant, and even then we had a Catholic population, it was still Christian, but now it's becoming much more diverse, and religions have different viewpoints. I don't know who was next, actually. Maybe this, yeah.
Oh, hi. I was just thinking about your arguments having to do with the lack of novelty in the idea of enhancement, and just looking at the example of the cosmetic industry that have been enhancements. Would you not agree that the process of evaluating enhancements brings up new ethical issues? Because in the process of the battle between in the process of countering the fears that people have in evaluating technology, one often has to do things like use animal models to try to demonstrate that things don't have disastrous effects, that the new technologies don't have them. So do you think that that creates problems that are maybe bigger than the ones that you were just talking about?
Maybe the use of animals in research?
Yeah, such things as that. Just even evaluating a technology may sometimes create big ethics issues that are
right. I mean, if you're someone, for example, who believes that animals, non-human animals, should never be used in research, that would be a problem. But that would be a problem for developing just ordinary drugs. I mean, because we use animal models as a basis for determining, at least the process under the FDA is you have animal studies. Once it's shown that it doesn't cause at least immediate problems, then you progress to human studies. Although I certainly have regard for animals, certainly believe they should not be subjected to unnecessary suffering, I'm not someone who believes it's immoral to use animals in research. Again, weighing the benefits and harms, the fact is if we don't use animals in research, we would be prevented from developing a lot of drugs, again, not just enhancements. Because some people said you can use computer models, and computers are getting more sophisticated, that you can do some modeling on computers, but really to show that there are no harmful effects, I don't think there's really an alternative other than to use animals.
Well, just to clarify one point, what I was getting at is that an enhancement seems quite an optional thing, and judging from, for example, the cosmetic industry, that's much more optional than a life-saving treatment. So, yet it raises questions. You talked about some of the what-ifs involved, the effects on society, etc. So to evaluate those properly, wouldn't people end up resorting to sacrificing animals, etc., which would deepen that issue, and it would be difficult to justify it. That's what I was getting at. Yeah.
So your point is that it may be okay to use animals for therapeutic drugs, but not enhancements?
It's a question.
Yeah. Well, first of all, one problem is that, or not a problem, but the reality is a lot of enhancements come out of development of therapeutic drugs. For example, some of the drugs that people think may enhance cognitive capacity are being developed as a result of research into how to treat Alzheimer's. Because once you find a way to reverse certain neural damage, you can use perhaps the same drug or modification